The night was still in Los Angeles, a kind of quiet that only came in the late hours, when most of the city's chaos had finally burned itself out for the day. Streetlights hummed faintly, casting pools of pale orange across cracked sidewalks and empty intersections. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a car engine echoed, but for the most part, the world seemed frozen. And yet, beneath this quiet surface, an empire was moving. In those years, in those neighborhoods, a single name carried a weight that few dared to speak out loud: Ricky Ross. Not the rapper who would one day borrow his identity, but the real man who built an underground economy that would change America forever. People called him Freeway Ricky, because his operation stretched like the endless highways of Southern California, connecting neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city, state to state. In the 1980s, the world was changing, but nowhere was that change more dramatic than in South Central Los Angeles. The city was a cauldron, rising unemployment, factories shutting down, a community struggling to hold itself together while gangs battled for control of entire blocks. It was a time when the American dream seemed to be slipping through the fingers of those who needed it most. And into that void, something new arrived, something cheap, potent, and devastating: crack cocaine. The drug would become both a curse and a lifeline, depending on which side of the deal you stood. For Ricky Ross, it was the key to a fortune beyond anything he could have imagined. But to understand Ricky's story, you must first slow down and imagine what it felt like to be there, to walk those streets at night, to see the glow of neon store signs reflected on rain-soaked pavement, to feel the tension hanging in the air like static before a storm. The police cruisers that rolled through were not trusted protectors; to many, they were simply another danger to avoid. Opportunity felt scarce, almost non-existent. And yet, Ricky had a gift that set him apart from almost everyone else: he could see possibilities where others saw nothing at all. He was calm, soft-spoken, not the kind of man who shouted to make himself heard. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear gold chains or designer clothes, and he didn't spend recklessly just to prove a point. But behind that quiet demeanor was a mind that worked like a machine, precise, patient, calculating. Where others thought in terms of quick money, Ricky thought in systems. Distribution networks. Efficiency. Loyalty. He was, in many ways, less a stereotypical gangster and more a businessman who happened to deal in the most profitable product available at the time. The legend of Freeway Ricky Ross grew slowly at first, spreading through whispers and conversations passed over payphones and car windows. But before long, it seemed that everyone knew his name, even if they didn't dare to say it out loud. Parents warned their children about him. Rivals tried to outsmart him. Law enforcement quietly built files on him. And yet, despite the growing pressure, Ricky kept moving like a shadow, calm and unshaken, while the empire beneath him grew to a scale that few thought possible. This was no ordinary story of crime. This was the rise of a man who would one day control what some experts claimed was the largest crack cocaine empire in the United States, with daily profits rumored to reach millions of dollars. It was a story that stretched far beyond Los Angeles, rippling out into other cities, other states, even touching international politics through the controversial connections that would later be revealed. It is a story of ambition, of survival, of unintended consequences, and ultimately, of redemption. Tonight, as we sink into this tale together, the goal is not to glorify the past or to make a hero out of a man whose choices hurt many. Instead, it is to look closely at the human being behind the headlines. To understand how a boy with a dream of becoming a tennis champion turned into the so-called king of crack. To follow the path step by step, from childhood struggles, to the first risky deals, to the peak of power, to the downfall, to the quiet years of reflection that would transform him once more. As you listen, imagine the slow unfolding of this story like a long drive down the freeway at night. The road stretches ahead, endless, smooth, lit only by the glow of headlights. The city around you hums quietly in the dark. And somewhere in that darkness is Ricky Ross, calm, waiting, ready to tell his story. What you are about to hear is not just a crime saga. It is a window into a time and place when history was being written in real time, when decisions made in small apartments and back alleys would end up shaping the lives of millions. It is a story that begins in silence and builds towards something unstoppable. And just as the night in Los Angeles holds both peace and danger, Ricky's life would hold both fortune and ruin. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let the story begin. Ricky Donnell Ross was born on January 26, 1960, in Troop, Texas, a tiny, quiet town with long dirt roads and warm summer air heavy with the smell of pine. Life there moved at a slower pace, and for a time, his childhood seemed almost ordinary. His family didn't have much, but they had each other. Ricky's mother worked hard to put food on the table, doing what she could to make ends meet. His father, though present, struggled to provide in a world that seemed increasingly unforgiving to black working-class men. The Ross family's life in Troop was not glamorous, but it was simple. When Ricky was still young, his family made a decision that would change everything. They packed up and moved to Los Angeles, California, searching for better opportunities and a better life. The promise of the big city was intoxicating. Los Angeles, with its palm trees, sunshine, and glittering skyline, seemed like a place where dreams could come true. But South Central Los Angeles, the neighborhood where the Ross family landed, was not the postcard version of L.A. This was the late 1960s, and the area was still scarred by the Watts riots just a few years earlier. Poverty was rampant, tensions with the police were high, and opportunities for upward mobility were scarce. For Ricky, childhood in South Central was a mixture of wonder and danger. He spent his days exploring the streets with friends, riding bikes, and soaking in the vibrant street culture. Music was everywhere, soul, funk, and later the early seeds of hip-hop, blasting from cars and house parties. But along with the music came other sounds, police sirens, shouting, sometimes gunfire in the distance. Even as a child, Ricky could sense that there were invisible lines dividing the community, gang territories, blocks you could walk through safely and blocks where you had to watch your back. Despite the challenges, Ricky had something special, a natural athleticism and an easy charm that drew people to him. While other kids dreamed of being movie stars or musicians, Ricky discovered an unusual passion for a boy from his neighborhood, tennis. It started when he was just a kid, hanging around the local tennis courts, watching the older players volleying under the California sun. Something about the sport captivated him, the precision, the focus, the one-on-one battle between opponents. Before long, Ricky had a racket in his hand, and he found that he had a real talent for the game. Tennis became more than just a pastime, it became a lifeline, something that set him apart from the kids around him who were getting pulled into gangs and trouble. Ricky spent hours practicing, working on his backhand, his serve, his footwork. Coaches began to notice him. He was quick, agile, and determined. Tennis gave him discipline and hope that he could escape the cycle of poverty, that he could build a future far away from the concrete of South Central. This was a time in his life when the possibilities seemed endless. Ricky's dream was to earn a tennis scholarship and become a professional player. He idolized Arthur Ashe, the first black man to win Wimbledon, and saw in him a blueprint for what might be possible. Ashe had broken barriers on the court, and Ricky believed he could follow in those footsteps. Tennis was his way out, his shot at rewriting his destiny. But beneath the surface, the environment around him was shifting. The 1970s were a turbulent time in Los Angeles. Factories were closing, jobs were disappearing, and drugs were beginning to seep into the neighborhoods. Heroin, PCP, and eventually cocaine became part of the urban landscape. Gangs like the Crips and Bloods were growing in power, and their wars for territory made the streets more dangerous with every passing year. Ricky's family tried to shield him from the worst of it, but there was only so much they could do. Still, Ricky kept playing. His dedication to tennis kept him focused through most of his teenage years. But there was a quiet storm brewing, something Ricky couldn't see yet, but something that would soon shatter everything he had worked for. School was never Ricky's strong suit. He was bright in many ways, quick on his feet and sharp in conversation, but academics were a challenge. Reading and writing, in particular, were difficult for him. He managed to get by for years, slipping through the cracks, relying on his charm and his athletic ability to carry him forward. But as he approached the end of high school, the cracks began to show. When it came time to pursue a tennis scholarship, Ricky faced a devastating reality: he could not read or write well enough to qualify academically. The realization hit him like a brick wall. All those hours on the court, all the dreams of playing professionally, they suddenly seemed to vanish. The door that tennis had opened for him slammed shut. It was a crushing blow, one that left Ricky feeling lost. For years, tennis had been his escape, the thing that kept him grounded. Now, with that path gone, he was left standing in the same neighborhood where the gangs were recruiting younger and younger kids, where quick money was tempting, and where survival sometimes meant doing things you never thought you'd do. Looking back, this was the moment when Ricky's life took its first fateful turn. The calm, disciplined boy who had spent his afternoons practicing his serve was now faced with a new reality: if he wanted a way out of poverty, he would have to find another path. And in South Central Los Angeles in the late 1970s, there were few paths more profitable, or more dangerous, than the streets. The transition wouldn't happen overnight. Ricky was still cautious, still hesitant to throw himself into a world that could swallow him whole. But the seed had been planted. The dream of becoming a tennis star was over. The question now was what Ricky would do next, and how far he was willing to go to change his circumstances. When Ricky's tennis dream ended, it was as if someone had turned off the only light in a dark room. For years, the game had been his compass, pointing him toward a future that felt bigger than South Central. Now, with that path gone, Ricky found himself standing at a crossroads with no clear direction. The courts were still there, the sun still shining on the asphalt, but every time he picked up his racket, it felt hollow, like practicing for a future he would never have. He didn't spiral into trouble immediately. Ricky was never the type to act impulsively. Instead, he lingered in that in-between space where young men often stand, wondering whether to play it safe or take a leap. He still tried to stay out of trouble, still tried to keep his mother proud, but the streets had a way of whispering to those who linger too long. The late 1970s were changing South Central fast. The neighborhood was becoming more dangerous, more unpredictable. Gang recruitment was rising, and so was unemployment. Ricky would walk past corners where kids his age, or younger, stood in groups, flashing cash, showing off new clothes, shiny cars. Some of them had barely been able to afford lunch money just a few months earlier. Suddenly, they had gold chains around their necks and girls on their arms. It was hard not to notice. Harder still not to wonder what they were doing and how quickly they'd gotten there. Ricky's introduction to hustling wasn't dramatic. There was no single movie-like moment where he suddenly became a criminal. It started small, almost quietly. A friend offered him the chance to make some quick money, just a little job, nothing too risky. At first, it was petty hustles, running errands, helping friends with small schemes, doing favors for a few dollars. Ricky was careful, learning by watching. He paid attention to how deals were made, how people carried themselves, who could be trusted and who couldn't. He didn't drink or smoke, not even marijuana. That alone made him different from many of the guys he hung around with. Ricky was clear-headed, always watching, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He began to realize he had a knack for this life, not because he loved crime, but because he was good at reading people. The turning point came when Ricky was introduced to cocaine, not as a user, but as a product. At the time, powder cocaine was considered a luxury drug, something reserved for the wealthy or the nightclub scene. It was expensive, glamorous even, associated with Hollywood parties and record executives. Ricky didn't see it as glamorous. He saw it as math. Supply and demand. People wanted it, and they were willing to pay a lot for it. The profits were undeniable. He started small, just a few grams at a time, working with people he trusted. His early customers weren't gang members or addicts, they were people looking for a good time, partygoers who could afford to pay top dollar. Ricky realized quickly that he had found something with the potential to change his life. But with every dollar he made, the stakes grew higher. The streets of Los Angeles were becoming more violent, and anyone who had something to lose was a target. Ricky knew he had to be careful. He kept a low profile, avoided unnecessary attention, and most importantly, stayed disciplined. He didn't spend money recklessly. He didn't throw parties or show off flashy jewelry. That was part of what made him so different from other hustlers, and what made him so successful in the long run. People began to respect him not just as a dealer, but as someone who treated this as a business. Still, there were moments of danger. Every transaction carried a risk. Police were cracking down harder, and rival hustlers were always looking for a way to muscle in on someone else's territory. Ricky learned to trust his instincts, to walk away when something felt off, to keep his circle small. In those early years, Ricky was building more than just a reputation, he was building a system. He began to experiment with ways to move more product, more efficiently, to reach more customers without taking on more personal risk. His natural talent for organization and strategy began to shine. But something else was brewing, something that would take Ricky's small-time operation and turn it into something unprecedented. Crack cocaine was about to arrive in Los Angeles. At first, Ricky didn't even know what it was. Nobody did. It was cheaper, faster to make, and more addictive than powder cocaine. When it hit the streets, it spread like wildfire. Customers who once paid hundreds for powder could now get a stronger high for a fraction of the price. Demand exploded almost overnight. Ricky recognized the opportunity immediately. While others hesitated, unsure of what to make of this new form of cocaine, Ricky moved quickly. He realized that by switching to crack, he could sell to a wider base of customers, moving more product, more frequently, and making more money than ever before. It was a decision that would define the next chapter of his life, and would eventually make him a household name, even in neighborhoods he had never set foot in. As Ricky's operation began to grow, so did the dangers. The more successful he became, the more he had to watch his back. There were nights when he lay awake, listening to the distant sound of gunshots, wondering if his time would come. He knew the risks. He knew that with every dollar he made, he was one step closer to a future that could end in prison, or worse. But he also knew something else. For the first time since he had lost his dream of becoming a tennis player, he had a sense of control over his destiny. The streets were dangerous, yes. But they were also where Ricky discovered that he had the ability to rise above his circumstances, to build something that no one could have imagined for a kid who had once been told he couldn't make it. What Ricky couldn't know then was just how big it would get, or how heavy the crown would feel once he became the king. The first real steps Ricky took into the drug game felt less like a leap and more like slipping quietly into a river that was already moving. He hadn't set out to become a kingpin, hadn't drawn up some grand plan. It happened slowly, almost quietly, until suddenly he realized there was no turning back. In those early days, Ricky's life still felt strangely ordinary. He wasn't living in a mansion or driving luxury cars. Most mornings started the same way, the California sun pushing its way through the smog, the streets already alive with kids heading to school, mothers yelling at them to hurry up, music drifting out of passing cars. Ricky blended into this background, just another young man trying to find his place in a city that often seemed too big and too fast for anyone to truly hold on to. But behind that ordinary exterior, something was beginning to take shape. Ricky had started building a small network of people he trusted, friends, cousins, acquaintances who could move product in their own neighborhoods. He didn't see himself as a boss yet. It was just a way to keep things organized, to make sure everyone made money without stepping on each other's toes. The work itself required a kind of quiet discipline. Deals were arranged carefully, usually over payphones or through word of mouth. Ricky preferred to stay in the background, letting others handle the hand-to-hand transactions while he focused on keeping the supply steady. He was learning, even then, that survival in this business wasn't just about who could make the most money, it was about who could avoid unnecessary noise. And yet, there was a growing energy on the streets, a sense that something new was happening. The arrival of crack cocaine was like dropping a spark into dry grass. Almost overnight, demand skyrocketed. Ricky saw people who had never touched drugs before coming back again and again, hungry for more. The money was faster, the customers more frequent, the product cheaper to produce. At first, Ricky was cautious. He watched how others were doing it, studied what worked and what didn't. But it didn't take long for him to understand that this was the future of the drug trade, at least in Los Angeles. Powder cocaine had been profitable, yes, but this was different. Crack made the market bigger, wider, and far more accessible. So Ricky began to scale up. He started buying in larger quantities, negotiating better deals with suppliers. He rented safe houses where product could be cooked, packaged, and stored. He began to think like a strategist, figuring out which neighborhoods were underserved, which corners could move the most product, which people he could trust to hold weight without skimming or stealing. There was something almost businesslike about the way he went about it. Where others relied on fear and intimidation to control their operations, Ricky relied on loyalty. He paid his workers well, made sure they felt taken care of, and as a result, people rarely betrayed him. His operation ran smoother than most because everyone had a stake in keeping it running. But with growth came new challenges. The streets were watching. Competitors noticed the sudden movement. The increase in traffic, the corners where Ricky's people were selling out night after night. It was only a matter of time before someone tried to muscle in. That was the first time Ricky truly understood the other side of the business, the part that wasn't about money, but about power. To keep his operation intact, he had to start thinking not just about profit, but about protection. He forged alliances where he could, kept relationships strong with neighborhood figures who had influence, and made sure that crossing him would never seem worth the trouble. Still, Ricky wasn't a violent man. He didn't carry himself like a gangster. If anything, his calmness unnerved people more than threats ever could. He had a way of looking at someone, of speaking softly but firmly, that made them know he meant business. He avoided fights when he could, but when confrontation became necessary, Ricky didn't hesitate to stand his ground. The money coming in now was unlike anything he had ever seen. Some nights, he would sit quietly in a room counting stacks of bills until his hands ached. The piles of cash no longer seemed real, just paper that needed to be moved, invested, hidden. And yet, despite the growing fortune, Ricky kept his life simple. No flashy chains, no champagne parties. He drove modest cars, dressed plainly, and preferred to let people underestimate him. But while Ricky kept his profile low, the streets were changing around him. Violence was becoming more common. The same drug that was making Ricky rich was also tearing through families, fueling gang wars, and filling up morgues. It was a contradiction Ricky lived with every day. He was building wealth and influence, yes, but at a cost that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Late at night, when the city was quiet, Ricky sometimes thought about the path he was on. The boy who once dreamed of Wimbledon was gone, replaced by a young man who was now feeding a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy. The money was good, better than anything he had ever imagined, but it came with a weight he couldn't quite shake. And yet, he kept going. Each successful deal led to another, each connection opened the door to a bigger one. Ricky had a vision now, something that went beyond just survival. He wasn't just trying to get by anymore, he was building something. Something that would soon grow so large, so powerful, that it would stretch far beyond South Central. Somewhere deep down, Ricky must have known that this couldn't last forever. That empires built in the shadows always attract the light sooner or later. But in those early days, all he could see was the opportunity ahead, the money flowing faster and faster, the empire quietly taking shape. What he couldn't see, not yet, was how big it was about to get, or how far his name would travel before the world finally caught up with him. The city was changing, and Ricky could feel it. There was a shift in the air, a pulse running through Los Angeles that was faster, harder, more desperate. Powder cocaine had been profitable, but it was expensive, a luxury drug for the well-off, the club crowd, the music industry insiders. Most people in the neighborhoods Ricky moved through couldn't afford it, not in the quantities they wanted. And then came crack. It was a small discovery at first, a new way to cook cocaine into a form that could be smoked rather than snorted. What emerged were hard, rock-like crystals that delivered a quicker, more intense high, and perhaps most importantly for the market, could be sold in smaller, cheaper quantities. Suddenly, cocaine wasn't just for the rich. Now it could be bought for $10 on a street corner, by almost anyone. The first time Ricky saw crack, it wasn't in a boardroom or some organized demonstration, it was on the street, in a simple setup. A friend showed him the process: take powder cocaine, mix it with baking soda and water, apply heat, and watch it harden into rocks. It was fast, easy, and far cheaper than selling powder by the gram. Ricky didn't get caught up in the high he wasn't using. Instead, he saw the math. His mind worked through the calculations almost instantly. Smaller pieces meant more buyers. More buyers meant faster turnover. Faster turnover meant more profit, more reach, and more control. What struck Ricky most was how quickly it spread. It wasn't just a new product, it was a phenomenon. Within weeks, corners that had been quiet suddenly became busy, crowded even, as users lined up for their next hit. People who had never touched cocaine before were trying crack because it was cheaper, more accessible. Demand exploded, and so did the money. Ricky understood that he was standing at the edge of something massive. He moved quickly, faster than most of his competitors, to scale up his operations. If powder cocaine had been his apprenticeship, crack was his moment to go all in. He set up dedicated cooking houses where the conversion could be done in bulk, creating a steady, reliable product. He tightened his distribution network, making sure the streets were never dry. He kept prices low enough to dominate the market, but high enough to keep profits climbing. Within months, Ricky's operation had gone from small-time hustle to a full-scale business empire. Money poured in faster than anyone could have imagined. There were days when Ricky's crew would count hundreds of thousands of dollars, stacks so high they had to be weighed because it took too long to count by hand. It wasn't unusual for Ricky to make millions in a single week. And yet, through it all, Ricky kept his cool. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He wasn't throwing wild parties or drawing attention to himself. His approach was almost monastic compared to other dealers. While others were buying flashy cars and gold chains, Ricky reinvested in the business: more product, more infrastructure, more people. But the rise of crack wasn't just an economic boom for Ricky. It was reshaping the very fabric of Los Angeles. Entire neighborhoods changed seemingly overnight. Abandoned houses became crack houses. Addiction rates soared. The violence that came with the trade intensified. Gangs fought bloody wars over territory, and innocent bystanders were often caught in the crossfire. Ricky noticed it. He wasn't blind to what was happening. He saw friends and family members fall into addiction, saw the desperation in the eyes of people who used to be strong, proud members of the community. But by now, the machine he had built was running too fast to stop. The demand wasn't slowing down, if anything, it was accelerating. The police began to notice too. At first, they were caught off guard by how quickly crack had taken over, but soon they were running raids, kicking down doors, making arrests. The newspapers began reporting on what they called the crack epidemic. Politicians called for tougher laws, harsher sentences, more police funding. And in the middle of it all was Ricky Ross, not yet a household name, not yet on the evening news, but moving quietly behind the scenes, controlling a pipeline that seemed endless. What made Ricky's rise so unique was his approach. He wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He didn't rely on open threats or flashy displays of power. He treated it like a business, and in a strange way, that professionalism kept him safer than many of his rivals. People trusted him. They respected him. Some even admired him for the way he gave them work and paid them fairly when so many others would cheat or exploit. But power has a way of drawing attention, no matter how quietly it is held. As Ricky's network spread beyond South Central, beyond Los Angeles, into other cities, the scope of what he was building became impossible to ignore. The streets called him the King of Crack, a title that came with both admiration and danger. At night, Ricky sometimes thought about how far he had come, from a boy dreaming of tennis courts to a man who now controlled an empire. The money, the influence, the connections, they were intoxicating, even if Ricky never showed it outwardly. But deep down, he must have known that this kind of rise could not go unnoticed forever. The government was starting to take the crack epidemic personally, framing it as a war that needed to be fought with everything they had. And Ricky, whether he wanted to be or not, was becoming the face of the problem. For now, though, Ricky kept building. The perfect storm was still gathering. The money was flowing faster than ever. And though he didn't know it yet, the forces that would one day bring him down were already quietly setting their sights on him. The rise of Ricky Ross's empire was not an overnight explosion, but it felt that way to anyone watching from the outside. One day, he was a quiet figure in the background, moving small amounts of cocaine through a few trusted friends. The next, his network stretched across Los Angeles like an invisible web, touching every corner of the city, every neighborhood where demand for crack was rising faster than anyone could supply it. What made Ricky different was how he thought. Most dealers focused on today's money, tonight's deal, tomorrow's hustle. Ricky was thinking weeks ahead, months ahead. He thought like a general mapping out a campaign, like an engineer designing a system. He figured out that if he kept prices low and product pure, he could outsell and outlast everyone else in the city. That philosophy became the foundation of his empire. He streamlined everything. He organized supply lines so that there were no bottlenecks, no excuses for being out of product. He found dependable cooks who could process powder into crack quickly and efficiently. He trained distributors to handle their corners like professionals, not just thugs with bags to sell. Ricky created layers of trust, suppliers, managers, sellers, and each layer kept him further removed from the risk of being caught in a direct transaction. Money moved in astonishing quantities. Ricky would sometimes sit in a quiet back room as duffel bags of cash came in, one after another, until they filled the space. His people would work through the night, weighing stacks instead of counting, because the money was simply coming in too fast. At the peak of his business, Ricky's network was moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine every week. The profits were staggering. Some estimates put his daily revenue at over $2 million. $2 million, every single day, in cash. For a young man who had once been shut out of a tennis scholarship because he couldn't read, the numbers were almost surreal. And yet, Ricky stayed grounded. That was what made him so unusual. While other dealers bought luxury cars and fleets and flaunted their riches at clubs, Ricky drove modest vehicles and dressed in plain clothes. His wealth was hidden in safe houses, in reinvestments, in building the machine bigger and stronger. He wasn't interested in being famous, he was interested in being untouchable. But with growth came exposure. More people in the operation meant more potential for betrayal, more risk of someone getting sloppy. Ricky managed this by creating loyalty. He paid fairly, sometimes even generously. He took care of people who worked for him. If someone was arrested, Ricky would often make sure they had a lawyer. That loyalty kept his crew tight and kept law enforcement from getting too close, at least for a while. Even with his calm approach, Ricky wasn't naive. He knew violence was part of the game, and he wasn't afraid to take measures to protect what he had built. But he never glorified it. He didn't go looking for fights, didn't use fear as his first tool. His reputation did much of the work for him. People understood that Ricky Ross wasn't someone you crossed lightly. There was also another side to his operation, one that made him both respected and controversial in his community. Ricky wasn't just taking from the neighborhood, he was giving back. He sponsored local events, helped families with rent, and created jobs for people who had no other way to earn money. For some, he was almost a Robin Hood figure, a man who had turned the very system that had failed him into a source of power and opportunity. But this was still drug money, and the consequences were everywhere. The crack epidemic was growing worse, leaving devastation in its wake. Families were breaking apart, addiction was rampant, and violence between gangs was spiraling. Ricky's empire thrived in that chaos, but it also became one of the engines driving it. Late at night, Ricky sometimes sat alone, thinking about what he had built. The quiet moments were rare, most of his days were filled with constant movement, meetings, phone calls, counting money, arranging deals. But in those rare moments, he would wonder if there was a way out. If there was a point where he could simply stop, walk away, and live quietly somewhere far from the streets of South Central. For now, though, he stayed in motion. He couldn't slow down, not when the demand was still climbing, not when his competitors were still trying to catch up. The system he had built was running at full speed, and Ricky was at the center of it, calm, composed, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. Law enforcement was starting to take notice in a bigger way. The DEA, the LAPD, federal prosecutors, they all began to see the same name come up again and again. Freeway Rick Ross. They didn't know much about him yet. To them, he was still a ghost, a name whispered by informants, a rumor passed along by smaller busts. But they were beginning to realize that whoever he wasn't just another street dealer. He was something bigger. And Ricky knew it too. He could feel the pressure starting to build, the quiet hum of surveillance, the occasional tale he would notice in his rearview mirror. But for now, the machine kept running. For now, the money kept coming. For now, Ricky Ross was untouchable. What he couldn't see yet was that the very precision and scale that made him so successful would also make him impossible to ignore. The empire he had built, brick by brick, deal by deal, had become too large to stay in the shadows forever. And somewhere, in some federal office, someone was beginning to draw a circle around his name. By the early 1980s, Ricky Ross's name was no longer just a whisper on the streets of South Central, it had become something larger, almost mythic. His network had grown so vast, so efficient, that it stretched far beyond Los Angeles. The freeway, in his nickname, was no longer just a reference to where he had started, it had become a symbol of how his operation moved, fast, smooth, connecting cities like highways connect states. The numbers were staggering. On a good day, Ricky's operation could move hundreds of kilos of cocaine. The money that came back was unlike anything most people had ever seen. Stacks of cash filled closets, garages, even entire apartments. Counting it by hand became pointless, there was simply too much of it. Ricky and his crew began weighing the money instead, using scales meant for produce or shipping, calculating totals by weight because counting every bill would take days. This was the height of his empire. His network was no longer just local, it was regional, stretching into cities like St. Louis, Cincinnati, and beyond. Ricky had become the key supplier for countless smaller distributors who looked to him to keep their own operations running. If Los Angeles was the heart of the crack trade, Ricky Ross was its pulse. And yet, despite the unimaginable wealth and influence he now commanded, Ricky remained as disciplined as ever. He didn't show off. He didn't throw big parties or invite cameras into his life. He kept moving quietly, staying under the radar as much as possible. But even with all his caution, it was becoming harder to hide something of this scale. Cars would line up late at night near his distribution points. Crews worked in shifts, cooking, packaging, delivering. Money flowed in and out like a tide. The machine Ricky had built was now running at a pace that seemed unstoppable. But with size came vulnerability. Ricky had more people working for him now than ever before. Each one was a potential risk, a potential leak, a potential informant. The larger his empire grew, the more difficult it became to keep everything airtight. Ricky compensated by continuing to build loyalty. He paid well, made sure everyone got their share, and tried to avoid giving anyone a reason to betray him. At the same time, Ricky began thinking about ways to protect himself in the long run. He started investing in legitimate businesses, car dealerships, real estate, small ventures that could serve as fronts and as a way to clean his money. He dreamed of a day when he wouldn't need to hustle anymore, when he could live quietly off his investments and never look over his shoulder again. But the streets had a way of pulling him back in. The demand for crack was relentless. Every time Ricky considered slowing down, his phone would ring with someone desperate for a shipment, someone who needed product to keep their own network alive. Ricky knew that if he didn't supply them, someone else would, and that someone might not play as fair, might not pay as well, might bring violence into places Ricky had worked hard to keep stable. This sense of responsibility, whether real or just something Ricky told himself, kept him in the game longer than he might have stayed otherwise. He was no longer just a dealer, he was the center of a vast ecosystem. His decisions rippled outward, affecting hundreds of people, sometimes thousands. In South Central, Ricky's reputation had taken on an almost legendary quality. Some saw him as a savior, the man who gave them a way to make money when no one else would hire them, the man who put food on their tables and cash in their pockets. Others saw him as the face of destruction, the man whose product was turning brothers, sisters, mothers into addicts. Ricky knew both were true. And that was the weight he carried. Meanwhile, law enforcement was no longer just watching, they were hunting. The DEA had begun coordinating with local police, gathering intelligence, building cases. Ricky's name was appearing in reports, in wiretap transcripts, in testimony from informants. He had become a priority target, even if he didn't know the full extent of it yet. Still, Ricky felt untouchable. He had built the most sophisticated distribution network in the country, and he had done it without becoming a flashy target like so many other kingpins. He believed, perhaps rightly, for a time, that his intelligence and discipline would keep him ahead of the law. The peak of his empire was a strange time, a mix of triumph and tension, wealth and paranoia. Ricky could look around and see everything he had built, the money, the power, the respect. But he could also feel the pressure mounting. The walls were invisible for now, but they were slowly closing in. On some nights, when the city was quiet and the cash had been counted and the phones had finally stopped ringing, Ricky would sit alone and think about the road ahead. He wondered if there was a way to step off this ride before it crashed. But the truth was, the empire had grown too big to stop easily. Too many people depended on it. Too many lives, for better or worse, were tied to his decisions. What Ricky couldn't know was that the peak of his empire was also the beginning of its decline. Every dollar earned, every kilo moved, every deal struck was another data point for the investigators building a case against him. The higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be. But for now, he was still at the top. For now, Ricky Ross was the undisputed king of crack. And in the quiet of the night, with the city stretched out around him like a glittering ocean of lights, it must have felt like he was unstoppable. At the height of his empire, Ricky Ross had what most would call everything. Money poured in faster than he could spend it, an endless tide of green that stacked in. Duffel bags and lined hidden safes. But what set Ricky apart from so many other kingpins of his era was how little interest he had in flaunting it. He didn't drive the flashiest cars, though he could have bought a fleet. He didn't wear gold chains as heavy as anchors or bathe himself in designer clothes. Instead, Ricky remained reserved, almost modest, quietly reinvesting his earnings. To him, money was a tool, not a trophy. He used it to strengthen his network, to buy more product, to make the machine run smoother. Still, the sheer weight of his wealth was impossible to hide completely. Ricky bought properties, safe houses, stash houses, apartments where cash could be stored and product could be cooked. He invested in businesses that provided both legitimacy and cover, including car dealerships and real estate ventures. The dream of going fully legitimate was never far from his mind. He often told those close to him that he wanted a way out, that one day he'd step away from the game completely and live quietly off his investments. But the game had a way of pulling him back in. Even if Ricky himself didn't flaunt his riches, the scale of his operation meant others around him did. His lieutenants drove nice cars, wore new clothes, and spent freely. The neighborhoods where Ricky's crew operated were busy, humming with the constant traffic of customers. And with this kind of attention came risk, not just from law enforcement, but from rivals. Ricky had built his empire on loyalty rather than fear, but loyalty could only protect him so far. As money increased, so did temptation. There were whispers of people skimming off the top, rivals plotting to take over corners, enemies looking for weakness. Ricky handled these challenges calmly but firmly, often finding ways to resolve conflicts without unnecessary bloodshed. Violence was always the last resort, but everyone understood that Ricky wasn't to be crossed. And yet, with each passing month, the sense of pressure grew. The more powerful Ricky became, the more he realized how precarious that power was. He was running one of the largest drug networks in the country, and yet he couldn't advertise it, couldn't be proud of it publicly, couldn't put it in a bank or on a tax return. Every dollar he made was both a triumph and a risk, evidence that could one day be used against him. Paranoia, though quiet, began to creep in. Ricky was careful about where he went, about who he trusted. He avoided unnecessary meetings, kept conversations short, used payphones instead of traceable lines. He kept his circle as tight as possible, but even then, he knew that every person in the operation was a potential weak point. At night, Ricky would sometimes find himself staring at the ceiling, listening to the city outside his window. Sirens wailed in the distance, tires screeched somewhere far off, a dog barked. He wondered if tonight would be the night someone came for him, a rival, the police, the federal agents whose presence he could feel even if he couldn't see them yet. Despite this quiet tension, Ricky continued to give back to his community. He paid rent for struggling families, bought food for people who had nothing, sponsored youth events. In many ways, he saw himself as a provider, someone who was using his position to lift others up. For every critic who saw him as a destroyer, there were those who saw him as a savior, a man who had turned poverty into prosperity, at least for some. But Ricky was no longer the kid hanging around tennis courts, dreaming of Wimbledon. The man he had become was a figure of power, and power came with isolation. Few people could relate to the life he was living. Few could understand the stress of running something so large, so fragile, so dangerous. The empire kept growing. More houses, more workers, more cash. The phones never stopped ringing. There were days when Ricky barely slept, when his mind was constantly calculating, constantly scanning for threats. And yet, outwardly, he stayed calm. That was one of his greatest strengths. No matter how chaotic things became, Ricky rarely lost his composure. He had built an image of control, of quiet authority. But control was an illusion, and Ricky was starting to realize that even the most carefully built system could be toppled with the right amount of pressure. The DEA was now fully aware of him. They had informants whispering his name, surveillance teams piecing together his movements, prosecutors preparing cases. Ricky might not have known the full scope of what was coming, but he could feel the net tightening. The question wasn't whether Ricky Ross would be caught, it was when. Still, he pressed forward. He told himself that if he could just make enough money, just invest in enough legitimate ventures, he could step away before it was too late. But deep down, Ricky knew that the empire had grown too big, too fast. He wasn't just in the game anymore, he had become the game. And as any player in the streets knows, the game never lets you walk away easily. It was during the height of Ricky Ross's empire that one of the most extraordinary and controversial revelations in American drug history began to surface. For years, Ricky had relied on a steady supply of cocaine from his trusted connect, a man named Danilo Blandon. Blandon was calm, businesslike, and reliable, exactly the kind of supplier Ricky valued. Through Blandon, Ricky had been able to buy cocaine at prices so low that it gave him an almost unbeatable advantage over competitors. It was this connection that allowed Ricky's empire to grow to such massive proportions. But what Ricky didn't know, what almost no one knew at the time, was that Blandon's story was far bigger, far stranger, and far more political than he could have imagined. Blandon wasn't just another trafficker. He was a Nicaraguan exile with ties to the Contras, the U.S.-backed rebel group fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua during the 1980s. The Cold War was raging, and the United States saw Central America as a key battleground against communism. Money was needed to fund the Contra war effort, and according to later investigations, one of the ways that money was raised was through the sale of cocaine in the United States. This connection, between Ricky's supplier and a foreign covert war, would later become one of the most explosive scandals of its era. But in the moment, Ricky knew nothing about geopolitics. For him, it was simple: Blandon had the best prices, the best product, and a steady supply. Ricky was thinking about keeping the pipeline flowing, not about funding international conflicts. Years later, when investigative journalist Gary Webb published his groundbreaking Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News, the public was stunned. Webb alleged that the U.S. government had turned a blind eye to, and in some cases indirectly facilitated, the sale of cocaine in black neighborhoods to raise money for the Contras. And at the center of that pipeline, whether knowingly or not, had been Freeway Rick Ross. The idea was almost too big to comprehend. The crack epidemic, which had devastated entire communities, was now linked to Cold War politics. Ricky's empire, which had seemed like a purely local phenomenon, was actually connected to global forces far beyond Los Angeles. When Ricky learned about these connections, it changed how he saw his own story. He had thought of himself as a hustler who had outsmarted the system, a man who had built an empire from nothing. Now he realized he might have been a pawn in a much larger game, used to move product that served a purpose far beyond his own business. For Ricky, it was a strange and bitter truth to face. He had worked so hard to stay disciplined, to keep violence to a minimum, to run his operation like a business. And yet, in the end, he had been part of a machine that was bigger than him, one that was feeding chaos into the very neighborhoods he had grown up in. Gary Webb's reporting created a national firestorm. The Dark Alliance series spread like wildfire, particularly in black communities that had long suspected that the crack epidemic was more than just a coincidence. People asked hard questions. Why had this drug flooded their neighborhoods so quickly? Why had it taken so long for law enforcement to act, and why did it seem like the punishment for crack was far harsher than for powder cocaine, a disparity that would eventually fuel the mass incarceration crisis? For Ricky, this revelation came when he was already deep in the game, already under investigation. But looking back, it gave a sense of tragic scale to his life story. He wasn't just a drug dealer, he was, in some ways, a link in a chain that connected the streets of south-central Los Angeles to the jungles of Central America and the war rooms of Washington, D.C. The CIA connection remains one of the most debated parts of Ricky's legacy. Official investigations would later admit that elements of the U.S. government had, at minimum, looked the other way as cocaine entered the country to fund the Contras. The full extent of the connection is still argued over today, but the perception was enough to cement Ricky's story as something far bigger than an ordinary drug saga. And in the midst of this, Ricky kept running his empire. The product kept flowing, the money kept coming, and the streets stayed busy. But somewhere inside him, something must have shifted. Perhaps he realized that the game he was playing was not just about street corners and profits anymore, that he was now on the radar of forces that were much larger than local police. The story of Rick Ross and the CIA connection added another layer of danger. It meant that when the authorities finally came for him, they would not just be trying to arrest a drug dealer, they would be trying to send a message. This was no longer just about Los Angeles. It was about a national scandal, an international embarrassment, and the political cost of a war that had spilled onto American streets. And Rick Ross, whether he liked it or not, had become one of the central figures in that story. Late at night, Ricky might have thought about Blandon, about the chain of events that had led them to each other. Was it fate? Was it coincidence? Or was it something darker, a design he could never have escaped, no matter how carefully he had played the game? Whatever the answer, the revelation of the CIA connection was one of the turning points in Ricky's story. It added a sense of inevitability to what was coming next. The higher the stakes, the harder the fall, and Ricky was now playing at a level where the fall could shake the entire country. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine wasn't just a product, it was a force, reshaping the streets of Los Angeles and beyond. It was everywhere now, on every corner, in every alley, in every whisper between neighbors. And with its rapid spread came a darkness that no one could ignore. Ricky Ross had built his empire with a strange kind of order, almost like an architect designing a system meant to keep chaos at bay. But even he could not control what crack did to the neighborhoods he loved. At first, it seemed like opportunity, a way for people to make money when there were no jobs, to survive in a city that had long since abandoned them. But as the years went by, the costs began to show. Addiction tore through families like a storm. Mothers who had once worked double shifts to provide for their children were now disappearing for days, lost in the grip of the pipe. Fathers vanished, leaving homes broken. Kids roamed the streets without supervision, many of them drawn into the very business that was destroying their parents. The violence was unrelenting. Crack brought money, and money brought conflict. Gangs that had once fought over petty disputes were now fighting for control of million-dollar territories. Drive-by shootings became a nightly occurrence. People were killed for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, for owing the wrong person a few dollars, for being suspected of cooperating with the police. Even Ricky, as careful as he was to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, could not escape the fact that his product fueled much of this violence. He did not like guns, did not like open warfare in the streets, but there were times when force had to be used to keep the operation running. There were times when someone had to be reminded who controlled a corner, who set the prices, who made the rules. And then there were the overdoses. Ricky rarely spoke about them, but they weighed on him. He heard the stories, of people collapsing in alleys, of paramedics rushing into abandoned houses, of children finding their parents unresponsive. Each time, it was a reminder that the money he was making came at a staggering human cost. Law enforcement was ramping up its efforts as well. Police presence in South Central grew heavier, with more raids, more checkpoints, more patrols. The federal government had declared a full-scale war on drugs, and crack cocaine was enemy number one. The penalties for crack possession were far harsher than for powder cocaine, a disparity that would later be recognized as a major factor in mass incarceration. For the people on the streets, it felt like they were caught between two wars, the one being fought by dealers and gangs over control of the trade, and the one being fought by the police to shut it down. Ricky found himself in a strange position. On one hand, he was the provider, the man who made sure the pipeline never ran dry. On the other, he was watching his own community collapse under the weight of the very thing he was selling. It was a contradiction he lived with every day. He tried, in his own way, to keep some measure of balance. He paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. He gave money to mothers who had lost sons to gang violence. He offered jobs to people who needed them, hoping that by giving them work, he could keep them out of worse trouble. But he knew that none of it could undo the damage. The machine he had built was too big now, too powerful, too profitable to simply stop. At night, Ricky would sometimes drive through the neighborhoods where his product was most in demand. He would see the addicts, some barely more than shadows, pacing, twitching, waiting for their next hit. He would see the police cars, their red and blue lights flashing like silent warnings. And he would feel the tension in the air, the kind that made every noise seem louder, every shadow seem closer. The human cost of the crack epidemic was no longer an abstract concept. It was visible on every street corner, in every boarded-up house, in every child left behind. For Ricky, this was the most difficult part of his rise. He had money now, power, respect, but at what price? The streets were soaked in blood. The community was suffering. And deep down, Ricky must have known that sooner or later, this was all going to come back to him. The empire that had once seemed like salvation was starting to look like a trap. Each dollar he made was another link in the chain that tied him to this life, another reason for the law to come after him with everything they had. And yet, he kept going. He told himself it was business, that if he didn't supply the demand, someone else would. That it was better for him to control it, to keep it organized, than to let it spiral into total chaos under someone reckless. But no matter how he justified it, the truth was inescapable. The crack trade was tearing his world apart, even as it made him rich. The walls were closing in, slowly, silently, but undeniably. The police were getting smarter. The DEA was building its case. Informants were talking. Rivals were watching. And Ricky, despite all his calm, all his careful planning, all his quiet discipline, was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in years, the first edge of fear. By the late 1980s, Ricky Ross was no longer just a name on the streets. He had become a primary target for law enforcement. The DEA, the LAPD, the FBI, and even federal prosecutors were beginning to focus their attention on the man quietly controlling one of the largest drug networks in the country. Investigators had been hearing his name for years, whispered by informants, mentioned in wiretap transcripts, scrawled in the notebooks of undercover officers. Freeway Ricky. To them, he was a ghost, a man they had never caught in the act, never arrested with product, never directly tied to a crime scene. But they knew, or at least suspected, that he was at the center of it all. So they began to watch him more closely. It started with simple surveillance, unmarked cars parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion, following Ricky's vehicles at a distance, noting where he went and who he met. They logged addresses, wrote down license plates, documented the comings and goings at his stash houses. Ricky, always observant, began to notice the tails. Sometimes it was a car that seemed to appear too often in his rearview mirror. Other times it was the feeling, that prickling on the back of the neck that told him someone was watching. He had learned long ago to trust those instincts, and now they were telling him that something was changing. To stay ahead, Ricky became even more careful. He switched cars frequently, used payphones instead of home phones, moved product in smaller loads to reduce the risk of a single large seizure. He changed the locations of meetings at the last minute, never telling anyone where he would be until it was time to go. But the pressure was mounting. Law enforcement wasn't just watching anymore, they were building a case. They sent undercover agents to pose as buyers, to get close to Ricky's lieutenants, to learn the structure of his organization. Informants began feeding them information, some of it accurate, some of it intentionally misleading, as rival dealers tried to throw the authorities off their own scent. Each arrest of a mid-level distributor became an opportunity. Prosecutors would offer deals, reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, freedom in exchange for names. Slowly, piece by piece, they were assembling the puzzle. For Ricky, the paranoia was becoming harder to ignore. The empire that had once felt untouchable now felt vulnerable. Each phone call might be tapped. Each new face might be an informant. Each deal might be the one that brought the entire operation down. At night, Ricky's mind raced. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. How close were they? How much did they know? Was it time to get out, to disappear before it was too late? And yet, walking away was not so simple. The machine he had built was massive now, too big to shut down overnight. Too many people depended on it for income, too many obligations tied him to the streets. And then there was the money, the constant, flowing river of cash that seemed impossible to step away from. Law enforcement's presence in South Central was heavier than ever. Raids became a regular occurrence. Helicopters buzzed overhead, searchlights cutting through the night. Ricky knew it was only a matter of time before one of those raids landed on a house connected to him. Still, he kept his composure. If fear gripped him, he didn't show it. He moved like he always had, quiet, precise, calculating. But those closest to him could sense the shift. Ricky was more cautious, more selective about who he worked with, more deliberate in every move. There were close calls. Times when police raided stash houses just hours after product had been moved. Times when friends were arrested and Ricky waited anxiously to see if they would talk. Each time, he escaped, but each time, the net seemed to draw tighter. The federal government was now deeply invested in bringing him down. This was no longer just about one man, this was about sending a message. The crack epidemic had become a national crisis, and Ricky Ross had become one of its symbols. To take him down would be a victory they could put on the front page, proof that the war on drugs was working. As the investigation deepened, Ricky began to sense a strange inevitability. He had always known this day might come. Every hustler knows the risks: prison, death, betrayal. Ricky had avoided them longer than most, but even he could not avoid them forever. In quiet moments, he thought about what it would mean to be caught. To sit in a courtroom and hear a judge read his sentence. To spend years, maybe the rest of his life, behind bars. To watch the empire he had built crumble piece by piece until nothing remained. And yet, he kept moving. Kept planning. Kept believing that maybe, just maybe, he could stay ahead a little longer. But deep down, Ricky must have known that the clock was ticking. The surveillance teams weren't going away. The case files were getting thicker. The prosecutors were sharpening their knives. The beginning of the end had arrived, and Ricky, calm and calculating to the last, was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The day it all came crashing down started like so many others, quiet, unremarkable, just another move in the never-ending game Ricky Ross had been playing for years. The sun was out, the Los Angeles sky washed in its usual haze, the city alive with its steady hum. Ricky had grown used to the pressure, the constant feeling that someone was watching. But that day, there was no warning, no siren in the distance telling him that everything was about to change. By now, the DEA had been tracking Ricky for months, building the kind of case that didn't just rely on suspicion, it relied on undeniable evidence. They had wiretaps, surveillance logs, cooperating witnesses. They were waiting for the perfect opportunity, a moment when Ricky would be caught red-handed with enough product to guarantee a conviction. That opportunity came in the form of a deal. A large one. Ricky had been semi-retired by this point, trying to put distance between himself and the business. He was thinking seriously about leaving the game for good, focusing on legitimate ventures, stepping away before it was too late. But like so many hustlers before him, he found himself drawn back in for one last big score, one last transaction that could set him up forever. The setup was carefully crafted. An informant, someone Ricky trusted, introduced him to what seemed like a promising new supplier. The conversations were calm, casual, even friendly. Ricky had always prided himself on reading people, on knowing who to trust. This man seemed solid, convincing enough that Ricky agreed to move forward. The deal was arranged in San Diego, far from Ricky's usual territory. That alone should have been a warning, the kind of thing that made Ricky's instincts flare. But the numbers were too good, the profit too big to pass up. He told himself it would be quick, clean, in and out. What Ricky didn't know was that every word, every handshake, every mile driven that day was being watched, recorded, documented. DEA agents were in place long before he arrived, hidden in cars, monitoring from a distance, waiting for the signal. The meeting itself was calm, almost unnervingly so. Ricky examined the product, counted the weight, made small talk. It felt like any other deal he had done 100 times before. But just as the final exchange was about to take place, the quiet shattered. The agents moved in fast, surrounding the scene in seconds. Vehicles boxed Ricky in from all sides. Doors flew open. Shouts rang out, commands to get down, hands in the air. The air filled with the sounds of boots hitting pavement, the metallic clatter of rifles being raised, the thud of agents rushing forward. Ricky didn't run. Maybe he knew there was no point. Maybe he knew that this was the moment he had been outrunning for years, the moment that had been waiting for him at the end of this road all along. He put his hands up, calm even now, his face unreadable. In that instant, the king of crack was no longer untouchable. The man who had once moved millions of dollars in product, who had built an empire so vast that it seemed invisible, was now just one man, kneeling on the ground with agents swarming around him, cuffing his hands, reading him his rights. The whole thing was over in minutes. As Ricky sat in the back of the car, the weight of it all began to settle over him. The streets outside were the same as they had always been, people going about their business, kids playing, traffic rolling by, but for Ricky, everything had changed. The machine he had built was about to be dismantled piece by piece, every connection exposed, every dollar traced, every loyal soldier either arrested or forced to scatter. Back in Los Angeles, word spread quickly. The man everyone thought could never be touched had finally been caught. To some, it was a moment of relief, the end of an era that had brought so much pain to their neighborhoods. To others, it was a tragedy, the fall of a man they had respected, even admired, for his discipline and his ability to rise above poverty. For Ricky, there was no cheering, no shouting, no tears. He remained quiet, composed, as though even now he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him break. That night, as he sat in a cell, the silence must have been deafening. No ringing phones. No late-night counting sessions. No crews waiting for instructions. Just four walls, a metal bunk, and the knowledge that the world outside was moving on without him. The sting operation had been flawless, the kind that prosecutors dream of, clean evidence, recorded conversations, physical product seized. There would be no easy way out this time, no technicality to escape on. For years, Ricky had been the master of staying one step ahead. But in that moment, staring at the ceiling of a holding cell, he must have realized that there were no more steps to take. The game, at least for now, was over. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he must have wondered, was this the end of his story, or just the beginning of a very different chapter? The courtroom was cold. Not physically, perhaps, the air conditioning hummed quietly, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, but there was a chill in the atmosphere, the kind that settles over a room when a man's future is about to be decided. Ricky Ross sat quietly at the defense table, dressed in a suit that fit well but could not disguise the reality of his situation. Around him, lawyers shuffled papers, whispered strategy, and prepared for the battle ahead. It was strange for Ricky, after years of controlling the streets, to sit in a place where he had no control at all. The courtroom was its own world, with its own rules, its own hierarchy. The judge presided like an immovable mountain. The jury sat in silence, watching, listening, waiting. Prosecutors moved with confidence, their case prepared down to the last detail. The charges against Ricky were massive. The DEA sting operation had produced ironclad evidence, recorded conversations, testimony from informants, and, most damning of all, the product itself seized during the deal. The government was seeking to make an example of him. The war on drugs was in full swing, and Ricky Ross had been painted as one of its central villains, the man who had turned South Central into the heart of the crack epidemic. The prosecution's opening statement was clear, powerful, and deliberate. They told the jury that Ricky Ross was no small-time dealer, that he was the mastermind of one of the largest drug networks in American history. They laid out the numbers, hundreds of kilos of cocaine, millions of dollars in profit, distribution networks that stretched across multiple states. They spoke of the devastation crack had caused, the violence, the addiction, the broken families, and tied it all back to the man sitting silently at the defense table. Ricky's lawyers fought back hard. They argued that Ricky had been entrapped, lured back into the game after he had begun stepping away from it. They pointed to his efforts to go legitimate, to invest in businesses, to leave the streets behind. They questioned the credibility of the informants, pointing out that many had received reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. But the evidence was heavy. The jury saw photographs of the cocaine, heard the tapes of Ricky discussing the deal, read transcripts of the conversations. Piece by piece, the prosecution built its case until it became undeniable. Ricky sat through it all quietly, his face calm, betraying little emotion. Those who watched him said it was as though he had already made peace with whatever was coming. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, whispering with his attorneys when necessary. But he never lashed out, never shouted, never let frustration show. As the trial wore on, the weight of it began to settle over everyone in the room. The gallery was often filled with onlookers, reporters, law students, members of the community curious to see the man whose name had become legend. Some came hoping to see justice served. Others came in quiet solidarity, believing Ricky had been targeted by a system that had failed him long before he ever sold a single rock. Finally, after days of testimony and arguments, the jury returned with its verdict. The room went silent as the foreperson stood and began to read. Guilty. Count after count. Guilty. The words fell like hammers, one by one, closing off every possible escape route. Ricky didn't flinch. He didn't hang his head or cry out. He simply sat there, absorbing the words, letting them wash over him. Perhaps he had known all along that this was where the road would end. The sentencing hearing came weeks later, and by then the outcome was clear. The prosecution was asking for life without parole, the harshest penalty available. They argued that Ricky's empire had caused untold harm, that he had profited from the suffering of his own community, that he deserved to spend the rest of his days behind bars. Ricky's lawyers pleaded for mercy. They spoke of his lack of prior violent offenses, of the people he had helped, of his efforts to educate himself and invest in legitimate businesses. They argued that he was not the monster the prosecution painted him to be, that he was a man who had made choices in a system stacked against him, and who deserved a chance at redemption. When the judge finally spoke, the room went silent again. Every eye turned toward the bench. The judge acknowledged Ricky's calm demeanor, his intelligence, and even his potential for rehabilitation, but in the end, the law was the law, and the scale of his crimes left little room for leniency. The sentence was pronounced, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air like a weight no one could lift. Ricky sat still, hands folded, his expression as calm as ever. No outburst, no visible anger. Just quiet acceptance. Those who knew him said later that it was the same look he had worn when he lost his tennis dream all those years ago, the look of a man who understood that a door had closed, and there was no way back through it. As he was led away in handcuffs, the gallery stirred. Some cried. Some nodded grimly. Reporters scribbled notes, already preparing their headlines, King of Crack sentenced to life. For Ricky, the world outside the courtroom grew distant. The noise, the flashing cameras, the buzz of conversation, it all faded as he was placed in a transport van, heading toward a future he had long feared but always known was possible. The empire he had built, the fortune he had made, the reputation he had earned, all of it had led here, to this moment. The rise had been spectacular, but now came the fall, as final and unforgiving as the clang of a prison gate closing behind him. Prison was a world unto itself, a place where time seemed to slow down and stretch endlessly, where every day looked almost exactly like the one before it. For Ricky Ross, the first days behind bars were the hardest. The sound of the heavy doors closing behind him, that deep, metallic echo, was like a final punctuation mark on everything he had built. The empire, the streets, the money, all of it was gone now. Inside, Ricky found himself stripped of the power that had once made him untouchable. He was no longer the man giving orders, no longer the center of a vast network. In prison, everyone wore the same uniform, followed the same rules, walked the same corridors. It was humbling, almost surreal. At first, there was shock, the disorienting realization that this was not temporary, that this was life now. The routine was relentless. Morning started early, long before the sun came up, with guards shouting wake-up calls and the metallic clatter of gates sliding open. Breakfast was served in a noisy chow hall where the sound of trays and voices blended into a dull roar. Afterward came work assignments, exercise, counts, lockdowns, a rhythm that never seemed to change. For many men, prison became a place to harden, to grow bitter, to double down on anger. But Ricky chose another path. He had always been calm, thoughtful, deliberate, and now he turned that energy inward. If prison was where he would spend the rest of his life, he decided, then he would make that life count for something. One of his first goals was to learn what had once kept him from his dream, reading. Ricky had entered prison functionally illiterate, just as he had been when he missed out on a tennis scholarship. Now, with time as his constant companion, he committed himself to education. He sat with tutors, worked through books slowly, page by page, sounding out words, writing them down, practicing until the letters that had once seemed like a wall became a doorway. The process was slow, frustrating at times, but Ricky kept going. He read books about business, psychology, history, anything that could help him understand the world and himself. The more he learned, the more he began to see his past clearly, as though looking at it from a distance. He began to mentor younger inmates, teaching them what he had learned on the streets but also warning them about the cost. Many of them had grown up hearing his name, idolizing the myth of Freeway Ricky. Now here he was, sitting across from them in a prison yard, telling them the truth, that the money, the power, the reputation were not worth what they cost in the end. There were nights when Ricky would lie awake in his cell, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the prison, the buzz of the lights, the shuffle of guards on their rounds, the occasional shout from another cell block. In those quiet moments, he reflected on the choices that had brought him here. He didn't excuse them, didn't pretend they hadn't hurt people, but he also recognized the forces that had shaped him: poverty, lack of opportunity, a system that had left him with so few paths out. Prison also gave Ricky time to think about the bigger picture, not just his own life, but the crack epidemic itself, the CIA connection, the war on drugs. He read articles about Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series and about the national debate it had sparked. The world was still arguing about what had happened, about how much of it had been by design and how much by neglect. Ricky had lived it firsthand, and now he was seeing his story told in newspapers and books. It would have been easy to grow resentful, to spend his days replaying the sting operation in his head, thinking about betrayal, blaming others. But Ricky chose instead to focus on what he could control, himself. He became a student, a teacher, a quiet leader inside the walls. Years passed. The man who had once been the king of crack now spent his days reading, writing, exercising, mentoring. The transformation was slow, but it was real. Other inmates began to respect him not for who he had been on the outside, but for who he had become on the inside. Guards, too, noticed his demeanor, calm, polite, never causing trouble. The discipline that had once allowed Ricky to build an empire now helped him endure prison without losing himself. He kept his mind sharp, his body strong, his spirit steady. Even when hope seemed far away, he refused to give in to despair. Somewhere along the way, Ricky began to dream again. Not of tennis courts this time, not of fast money, but of freedom, and of what he might do with it if he ever got another chance. He thought about starting programs for at-risk youth, about teaching kids the skills that might keep them from following the path he had taken. He imagined standing in front of classrooms, telling his story not as a boast but as a warning. For now, though, all he could do was wait. Life sentences in the federal system were supposed to mean just that, life. But Ricky's legal team hadn't given up, and neither had he. Somewhere deep down, he believed that he would walk out of those gates one day, that he would get the chance to prove that his story didn't have to end here. And so he waited, patient as ever, watching the seasons change through the narrow window of his cell, holding on to the quiet hope that redemption might still be possible. The years passed slowly behind bars, each one blending into the next, but Ricky Ross never stopped thinking, never stopped planning. Even though he had been sentenced to life without parole, he refused to believe that this was where his story would end. Somewhere inside him, there was still a quiet flame of hope, a belief that if he stayed disciplined, stayed focused, and kept working, there might be a way out. Ricky's legal team shared that hope. They knew the case against him had been strong, but they also knew the sentencing had been harsh, perhaps too harsh. The laws surrounding crack cocaine at the time were some of the most punishing in the entire criminal code. Possessing even small amounts carried mandatory minimum sentences far longer than those given for powder cocaine, and Ricky's case had involved massive quantities. The government had wanted to make an example out of him, and they had succeeded. But the law was not static. Over time, public opinion about the war on drugs began to shift. Activists, lawyers, and community leaders began to argue that crack cocaine sentencing disparities were unjust, that they disproportionately affected black communities, that they were filling prisons with men who would never see freedom again. Slowly, reforms began to take shape, first at the state level, then federally. From inside his cell, Ricky watched these developments carefully. He spent hours in the law library, poring over case files, reading legal opinions, learning how the system worked. He began to draft letters, write motions, and work with his attorneys to explore every possible avenue for appeal. One of the first glimmers of hope came when an appellate court reviewed parts of Ricky's case. His attorneys argued that he had been the victim of entrapment, that the government's sting operation had lured him into committing a crime he might not have committed otherwise. They pointed to the fact that Ricky had been semi-retired from the game, that he had been actively exploring legitimate business ventures, that it was only the government's offer of a particularly lucrative deal that had brought him back in. At first, the appeals seemed to go nowhere. Judges upheld the conviction, citing the strength of the evidence and the fact that Ricky had willingly participated in the transaction. But his legal team kept fighting. They filed motion after motion, looking for any crack in the case, any point of law that might open a door. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the national conversation about sentencing reform was growing louder. Advocacy groups were shining a light on cases like Ricky's, showing how the crack sentencing guidelines had devastated communities and filled federal prisons. Lawmakers began to respond, introducing bills that would reduce mandatory minimums and allow for resentencing in certain cases. Then, finally, a breakthrough. Ricky's attorneys discovered that changes in federal law could potentially apply to his case. The new sentencing guidelines allowed judges to reconsider certain life sentences, particularly those handed down during the height of the crack epidemic, when punishments had been at their most severe. Ricky's team filed a motion for sentence reduction. It was a long shot, the kind of legal maneuver that could easily be denied, but it was a chance, and that was all Ricky needed. The process took months, with hearings scheduled and postponed, papers filed and argued. Ricky waited patiently, day after day, never letting his hope turn into desperation. He continued to mentor younger inmates, to read, to exercise, to keep his mind and body ready for the day he might walk free. Finally, the day came when he was brought into a courtroom once more, this time not for trial, but for resentencing. The atmosphere was different now. The judge acknowledged Ricky's behavior during his years in prison, his commitment to education, his lack of disciplinary infractions. He noted the national shift in sentencing policy, the growing recognition that punishments like Ricky's had been overly harsh. Then came the moment Ricky had been waiting for. The judge announced that his sentence would be reduced. Life without parole was no longer his destiny. There was now a date, a real date, on which Ricky Ross could expect to leave prison. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The sound of the judge's voice faded, the shuffling of papers and murmurs in the courtroom blurred. Ricky sat quietly, absorbing the words, letting them sink in. After so many years of staring at the same walls, the same bars, he now had something he had not had in decades, a future. When he was led back to the transport van that day, Ricky looked out the window at the sky, at the world beyond the fences. The world had changed since he had been locked up, new cars, new buildings, new technology, but one thing had not changed, his determination to make something of his life once he was free. For now, he returned to prison, but everything felt different. Each day was now one day closer to release, one day closer to stepping back into the world. The walls no longer felt quite so heavy. The bars no longer felt quite so permanent. Hope, once just a small ember, had become a fire. And Ricky Ross, who had once been the king of crack, was preparing for the next chapter of his story, one that would take him far from the empire he had built and into a life defined not by hustling, but by redemption. The morning of Ricky Ross's release was unlike any other morning he had experienced in years. The prison was still the same, the harsh fluorescent lights humming, the clang of metal doors echoing through the corridors, but for Ricky, everything felt sharper, more alive. Today was the day. After decades behind bars, after years of appeals and motions, after so many nights staring at the ceiling and wondering if this moment would ever come, he was finally going home. The process was slow, almost painfully so. Paperwork had to be signed. Property had to be returned, the small box of personal items that represented everything he had kept through all those years. He was given back the clothes he had been wearing when he first entered the system, though they no longer fit quite right. He had changed, the world had changed, but these items were like relics from another life. As he walked through the final corridor, escorted by a guard, Ricky could feel his heart beating faster. The last set of doors opened with a mechanical groan, and then he was outside, standing in the sunlight without bars or fences between him and the sky. It was almost overwhelming. The air smelled different out here, fresher, freer. The sky seemed impossibly wide. For years, Ricky had seen it only through a narrow window, a rectangle of blue or gray that reminded him of a world just out of reach. Now he could feel it above him, endless and open. Waiting for him were friends, family, and supporters who had never stopped believing he would make it out. There were hugs, handshakes, tears, and laughter. Cameras clicked as people documented the moment, but Ricky seemed calm, almost serene. He wasn't rushing, wasn't overwhelmed by noise or attention. He just stood there for a while, soaking it in, letting the reality sink in that he was no longer an inmate. The drive away from the prison was quiet. Ricky stared out the window like a man seeing the world for the first time. The cars looked sleeker, the roads busier, the billboards bigger and brighter. Cell phones were everywhere now, in everyone's hands. Technology had leapt forward in ways Ricky had only read about. The world he had left behind felt distant, almost like a memory from another lifetime. When he arrived back in Los Angeles, the city felt both familiar and completely different. Some streets looked exactly as he remembered them, but others had changed beyond recognition. New businesses had replaced old ones. Neighborhoods had been rebuilt, gentrified in places. There were fewer payphones, more surveillance cameras, more signs of a city that had moved on while Ricky had been gone. That first night out of prison, Ricky lay in a real bed for the first time in decades. The mattress was soft, the sheets clean, the room quiet except for the faint sounds of traffic outside. There was no guard walking the tier, no keys jangling, no sudden shouts from other inmates. For a long time, Ricky simply lay there staring at the ceiling, his hands behind his head, taking it all in. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a kid who once dreamed of tennis courts, to a young hustler on the streets, to the king of crack, to a man who had faced a life sentence and somehow walked out of prison alive and free. It felt unreal, almost like waking up from a dream. But Ricky knew that freedom came with its own challenges. He would have to rebuild his life from scratch. The world was not going to hand him anything. He had no fortune left, no empire to fall back on. The millions he had once made were long gone, seized by the government or lost to the winds of time. Still, Ricky was ready. Prison had taught him patience, discipline, and humility. It had given him time to think about what really mattered. He didn't want to go back to the life he had left behind. This was a second chance, and he intended to use it well. In the days that followed, Ricky began to adjust to freedom slowly, deliberately. He learned how to use a cell phone, how to navigate the internet, how to adapt to a world that was now driven by technology. He reconnected with family, mended broken relationships where he could, and began speaking to young people about his experiences. Walking through South Central again, Ricky saw reminders of the past everywhere: the streets where his crews once sold, the corners that had once been hotly contested, the neighborhoods that had been scarred by the very product he had helped distribute. There was pain in seeing it, but also purpose. This was why he had to tell his story. At night, when he sat outside and looked up at the sky, a sky he could now see without steel bars, Ricky felt something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Freedom was no longer an abstract idea. It was real, tangible, something he could breathe in with every lungful of air. He had been given back his life, and this time, he was determined not to waste it. Freedom, Ricky quickly discovered, was not just about walking outside the prison gates, it was about learning how to live all over again. In the first few weeks after his release, every small moment felt significant. Buying groceries. Using a smartphone. Sitting in a restaurant without a guard watching over him. Even something as simple as walking down the street felt surreal, a reminder that life on the outside moved at a different speed. But Ricky didn't intend to just enjoy freedom. He intended to use it. The years in prison had given him clarity, and with that clarity came a mission: to make sure others didn't repeat his mistakes. He knew the power of the streets, the temptation of fast money, the way poverty and hopelessness could lure a young person into a game they couldn't easily escape. Now he wanted to become the voice that warned them before they made that first fateful choice. One of Ricky's first steps was to begin speaking at schools, community centers, and youth programs. He would walk into a room full of teenagers, many of them from neighborhoods just like the one he had grown up in, and tell them his story. Not the glamorous version, not the myth of Freeway Ricky the Kingpin, but the truth: the sleepless nights, the paranoia, the friends lost to violence, the years spent behind bars. He spoke softly, the same calm voice he had always had, but his words carried weight. The kids listened. Some of them had grown up hearing his name as a legend, a cautionary tale whispered by their parents. To see him standing there, alive, speaking with such honesty, made the lesson hit harder. Ricky also began writing about his experiences, putting his story down on paper in his own words. For years, other people had told his story: journalists, prosecutors, authors, but now it was time for him to take control of the narrative. He wanted to show that he was more than just a headline, more than just the king of crack. He wanted to be remembered as someone who learned, who grew, who found a way to turn tragedy into purpose. It wasn't easy. The transition from prison to public life came with challenges. Ricky had to rebuild his finances from scratch. The fortune he once had was gone, seized or spent long ago. He had to learn the slow process of starting over, earning money legally, paying bills, building a future step by step instead of deal by deal. But Ricky's discipline served him well. The same patience and focus that had once made him such an effective businessman in the drug world now made him effective as a speaker and mentor. He built connections with community leaders, educators, and activists who supported his mission. Soon, he was traveling across the country, telling his story to anyone who would listen: schools, churches, universities, even conferences about criminal justice reform. Ricky became an advocate for literacy and education, telling young people that reading and writing were the keys that could open doors he had once thought closed forever. He often talked about how his inability to read as a teenager had cost him a tennis scholarship and changed the course of his life. "If I had been able to read," he would say, "my whole life might have been different." He also spoke about entrepreneurship, encouraging young people to channel their hustle into legal businesses, to take the same energy that went into street survival and use it to build something lasting. Ricky knew that many of the skills he had developed as a dealer, leadership, organization, negotiation, were the same skills that could make someone successful in legitimate business. Slowly, Ricky began to rebuild not just his life, but his reputation. He was no longer just the symbol of an epidemic, he was becoming a symbol of redemption. Media outlets began to interview him, documentaries featured his story, and his name once again became widely known, but this time, it was for a different reason. Still, Ricky never romanticized his past. When he told his story, he made sure to include the pain, the cost, the years lost. He didn't glorify the money or the power. Instead, he spoke about the emptiness it left behind and the freedom he had found in leaving it all behind. At night, when the day's work was done, Ricky would sometimes sit quietly, reflecting on how far he had come. The streets that had once been battlegrounds were now places where he walked freely, shaking hands, talking to kids, offering advice. The same neighborhoods that had once whispered his name in fear now welcomed him back as a teacher. But Ricky also knew that redemption was an ongoing process. He still had to work every day to stay focused, to keep building, to live up to the second chance he had been given. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the past still pressed on him, but he met those moments the same way he had met every challenge since leaving prison, calmly, steadily, one step at a time. Freedom had given Ricky Ross a new life, and he was determined to use it to keep others from losing theirs. Even as Ricky Ross rebuilt his life, a strange twist of fate was unfolding in the world outside. His name had taken on a life of its own. While Ricky was behind bars, a rapper from Miami named William Leonard Roberts too had risen to fame under the stage name Rick Ross. His deep, commanding voice and larger-than-life persona helped him climb to the top of the hip-hop charts, with hits that celebrated wealth, power, and the very world Ricky had once inhabited. At first, Ricky didn't think much of it. He was still adjusting to freedom, still focused on building a new life. But the more he saw of the rapper's music videos, the interviews, the performances, the more he began to feel a strange sense of disconnection. Here was a man using his name, his persona, even some details of his story, while Ricky himself was still fighting to define who he was beyond the king of crack. For Ricky, it wasn't about jealousy or fame. It was about identity. The name, Freeway Rick Ross, was not a creation, it was his life. He had lived it, paid for it, and carried the weight of it through prison. To see someone else profit from that identity, turning it into entertainment, felt like having a piece of himself taken away. So Ricky decided to fight back, not on the streets, but in the courtroom. He filed a lawsuit against the rapper and his record label, claiming that the use of his name and persona violated his right to publicity. He argued that the rapper's entire brand was built on the legend of Freeway Ricky, that his own life story had been turned into a commodity without his consent. The legal battle was high-profile, drawing national attention. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it became a debate about culture, art, and identity. Some argued that the rapper had the right to adopt the name as part of his artistic persona, that hip-hop had always been about reinvention, about taking on larger-than-life characters. Others sided with Ricky, saying that it was wrong for someone to profit off a real man's name, especially when that man was still alive and trying to reclaim his place in the world. The courtroom arguments were heated. Ricky's lawyers painted a picture of a man whose identity had been hijacked, whose real pain had been turned into entertainment. The defense countered that Rick Ross, the rapper, was a fictional character, a stage name, and that the public associated him with music, not with the real-life drug kingpin. In the end, Ricky lost the case. The court ruled that the rapper's use of the name was protected under the First Amendment, a form of artistic expression. It was a bitter disappointment for Ricky, not because he had hoped to make money from the lawsuit, but because it felt like the final word on who got to control his legacy. Still, Ricky did not let the loss define him. Instead, he used it as fuel. If the courts wouldn't give him back his name, then he would reclaim it himself, through action, through speaking, through writing. He doubled down on his mission, making sure that when people heard Freeway Rick Ross, they thought not just of a rap persona but of the real man who had lived the story. Interviews and documentaries began to feature Ricky more prominently. He spoke candidly about the lawsuit, about how it had forced him to confront the way his life had been mythologized and distorted. "I lived this," he would say. This wasn't a song or a costume for me. It was real. And I want people to understand that. Ironically, the controversy brought even more attention to Ricky's story. People who had known the rapper's music but never heard of the real Freeway Ricky began to learn about his life, his empire, his imprisonment, and his transformation. The lawsuit may have been a legal loss, but in many ways, it was a cultural victory, a reminder that there was a man behind the name, a man who was still here, still speaking, still shaping the narrative. For Ricky, the entire experience underscored the importance of legacy. He could not change the past, but he could shape how the world remembered it. And he was determined that the world would remember the truth, the rise, the fall, the redemption. Late at night, when he thought about the case, Ricky no longer felt anger. The sting had faded, replaced by resolve. He had fought for his name, and though the court had ruled against him, he had shown the world that he was still here, still claiming his story. In the end, that was what mattered most. The story of Freeway Ricky Ross is not just the story of one man, it is the story of an era. To truly understand his place in history, we have to step back and look at the bigger picture, the crack epidemic that swept through America in the 1980s and 1990s, reshaping entire communities, rewriting crime policy, and leaving scars that are still visible today. Crack was more than a drug, it was a social earthquake. When it hit neighborhoods like South Central Los Angeles, it spread faster than anyone could have predicted. It was cheap, potent, and addictive, a perfect storm that turned street corners into open-air markets overnight. For some, it was a way to make money when jobs were disappearing and opportunities were scarce. For others, it was an escape, a way to numb the pain of poverty, broken families, and systemic neglect. But the cost was staggering. Communities were devastated, not just by addiction but by the violence that followed. Gang wars erupted as rival crews fought for control of lucrative territories. Families were torn apart as mothers and fathers fell into addiction. Children grew up in homes where survival took priority over everything else. The government's response was swift and severe. Politicians declared a war on drugs, and crack became the #1 target. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, creating a 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. That meant that possessing just 5 grams of crack, an amount small enough to fit in a pocket, carried the same sentence as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. The result was an explosion in incarceration rates, particularly for black men. Entire generations were locked away, sometimes for life, for crimes that would later be punished far less harshly. Sociologists and historians now look back on that era as one of the most devastating chapters in the history of American criminal justice, a period that fueled mass incarceration and left lasting damage on communities of color. Ricky Ross's empire became one of the most infamous symbols of that era. The media painted him as the king of crack, a man whose network had fueled the epidemic at its peak. And in some ways, the label was true. Ricky's operation was massive, efficient, and far-reaching. But focusing only on Ricky risks simplifying a much bigger, more complicated picture. The truth is, Ricky's rise was a symptom of a system that had already failed. By the time he entered the game, South Central was already suffering from decades of disinvestment, unemployment, and racial inequality. Crack didn't create those problems, it thrived in them. And while Ricky made millions, the profits were short-lived. The government seized what they could, and what remained was quickly gone. When we talk about Ricky's story, it is easy to focus on the glamour of the rise or the drama of the fall. But perhaps the most important part of his story is what it tells us about opportunity, and what happens when it is denied. Ricky was a gifted athlete with the potential to earn a tennis scholarship, but his inability to reach shut that door. What might have happened if he had received the support he needed? Would he have gone down a different path entirely? These are the questions that make Ricky's story more than just a crime saga. They make it a lens through which we can examine the failures of education, the impact of poverty, the consequences of policy decisions. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how America handled the crack epidemic, not just by going after dealers, but by punishing addicts, criminalizing entire communities, and creating a cycle that took decades to break. Today, the conversation has shifted. There is growing recognition that addiction is a public health issue, not just a criminal one. Sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine have been reduced, and many men who were sentenced under the old laws have been granted early release. But the damage done during those years cannot be fully undone. Ricky Ross has become an important voice in that conversation. He speaks not only about his own choices, but about the larger forces at play, the poverty, the politics, the international connections that turned his business into a geopolitical scandal. He reminds people that the crack epidemic was not just a story of crime, but of survival, desperation, and policy failures that left entire neighborhoods vulnerable. In the end, Ricky's legacy is complicated, as it should be. He was both a product of his environment and a force that shaped it. He made choices that hurt people, yes, but he has also dedicated his life since prison to preventing others from making those same choices. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of his story, that redemption is possible, that a person can change, that even the darkest chapters can be followed by a new page. Ricky's life is proof that no one is entirely defined by their worst mistakes, and that the path forward, though difficult, is always there for those willing to walk it. Late at night, Ricky sometimes still reflects on the past, on the rise, the empire, the courtroom, the prison cell. But he also reflects on the present, the classrooms where he now speaks, the young people he inspires, the communities he is helping to rebuild. In that sense, his story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that the human spirit can endure, adapt, and rebuild, even after the most devastating storms. Night falls over Los Angeles, just as it has for decades, but the city is different now. The crack houses that once drew endless lines have been boarded up or demolished. The neighborhoods where gang wars raged are quieter, though their scars still linger. And somewhere in that city, Ricky Ross, no longer the king of crack, no longer a prisoner, moves through the streets with a calm dignity that comes from having lived through fire and come out the other side. Looking back on his life, it almost feels like a dream. The boy who once stood on a tennis court, racket in hand, dreaming of championships. The young man counting cash late at night, stacking duffel bags until they touched the ceiling. The inmate staring through steel bars, wondering if he would ever see the outside world again. And now, the speaker, the mentor, the man who stands before young audiences and warns them of the cost of chasing fast money. Ricky's journey is one of contrasts. He rose higher than most ever do, commanding millions of dollars a week, building a network that stretched across states, but he also fell as far as anyone can fall. Life without parole was supposed to be the end, the full stop on his story. Yet somehow, against all odds, that sentence was lifted, and Ricky was given a second chance. There is something deeply human about that arc, about falling, suffering, learning, and rising again. Ricky does not shy away from the darkness of his past. When he speaks, he does not glorify it or glamorize it. He talks about the fear, the paranoia, the endless pressure of running an empire that could collapse at any moment. He talks about the faces of those lost to addiction, about the families broken by the very product he sold. And he talks about hope, the hope that others will hear his story and choose a different path. In quiet moments, Ricky has said he sometimes wonders what might have been. What if he had learned to read as a boy and earned that tennis scholarship? What if he had pursued his dream of becoming a professional athlete? Would the name Ricky Ross be remembered not as the king of crack, but as a champion standing on the grass courts of Wimbledon? Those questions linger, but Ricky does not dwell on regret. He cannot change the past, he can only use it. His life has become a kind of living testimony to the idea that no one is beyond redemption, that even those who have made the gravest mistakes can find a way to give back, to teach, to heal. The legacy of the crack era is still debated. Historians write books about it, politicians apologize for the policies that fueled mass incarceration, and documentaries try to capture the complexity of those years. But Ricky's story is a reminder that history is not just made of statistics and policy decisions, it is made of human lives. His story puts a face to the numbers, a voice to the headlines. For those who listen to his journey, there is both warning and inspiration. Warning, because it shows how easy it is to be pulled into a world that seems profitable but ends in tragedy. Inspiration, because it shows that even after the worst choices, it is possible to rebuild, to change, to turn pain into purpose. As the night deepens and the city grows quiet, Ricky's story feels like it should be told under a soft light, in a calm voice, not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten, but as a meditation on the complexity of life. It is a story of ambition, consequence, survival, and redemption. It is about the choices we make, and the ones that are made for us, and how we find meaning in the aftermath. Ricky walks today as a free man, but he also carries with him the weight of memory. Perhaps that is the truest form of redemption, not forgetting the past, but letting it guide the future. In the end, the story of Freeway Rick Ross is not just about crime, or drugs, or money. It is about a boy who dreamed, a man who built, a prisoner who reflected, and a survivor who chose to rise again. And so we end where we began, in the quiet of Los Angeles at night. The streetlights cast their glow on empty sidewalks. Somewhere, a car hums softly down the road. The city, like Ricky, has seen darkness and kept moving forward. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the deals, the sirens, the courtrooms, but you can also hear something else, the steady, calm voice of a man who has lived through it all, telling his story so that others might never have to live it themselves. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you carry with you one last thought, that even in the darkest chapters, there can be light. That even a kingpin can become a teacher. That even the king of crack can find peace.